When Emily Grant stepped off that dusty Montana train, she thought she was walking toward her new life as a bride. Instead, she found herself publicly humiliated, abandoned, and fighting for survival in a land that didn't want her. But sometimes the greatest love stories begin with the most devastating rejections. Today, I'm sharing Emily's incredible journey from mail-order bride to ranch queen, a story of courage, fire, and unbreakable love forged in the American West. Stay with me until the end to see how one woman's refusal to give up changed everything, and comment below with your city so I can see how far this story travels. The Montana Territory stretched endlessly under a blazing August sun, and Emily Grant pressed her face to the grimy window of the westbound train, watching the landscape roll past in waves of golden prairie grass. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a mixture of excitement and terror that had been her constant companion for the past week. In her reticule, she clutched the carefully folded letters from Harold Denton, each one promising her a new life, a fresh start, and most importantly, a home. She'd read them so many times the paper had grown soft at the creases. My dear Miss Grant, your photograph and letters have convinced me that we are well suited for matrimony. I am a prosperous merchant in Copper Falls, Montana, and I can provide you with a comfortable home and security. Security. The word had been like a beacon in the darkness of her circumstances back in Ohio. After her father's death and the subsequent loss of their small farm to creditors, Emily had faced a choice between the poorhouse and answering Harold Denton's advertisement for a mail-order bride. At 23, she was considered past her prime by most standards, but Harold had seemed different in his letters, kind, respectful, and genuinely interested in building a partnership rather than simply acquiring a housekeeper. Copper Falls. Next stop, Copper Falls. The conductor's voice boomed through the car, and Emily's stomach clenched. She smoothed her best dress, a deep blue wool that brought out her eyes, and checked her reflection in the window. Auburn hair, neatly pinned, green eyes bright with nervous anticipation, and a complexion only slightly travel-worn from the long journey west. The train began its grinding halt, steam hissing and brakes squealing against the rails. Emily gathered her few belongings, a single carpet bag containing everything she owned in the world, and made her way toward the door. Through the window, she could see the platform buzzing with activity. Cowboys in dusty hats, ladies in calico dresses, and rough-looking men loading supplies onto wagons. She stepped down from the train, her boots hitting the wooden platform with a hollow thud. The August heat hit her like a physical blow, and dust swirled around her skirts as she looked around for Harold. According to his last letter, he would be waiting for her wearing his finest black suit and a red boutonniere. Miss Grant? Emily Grant. She turned toward the voice and felt her heart lift. A man approached her, tall, well-dressed in a black suit with thinning brown hair and a nervous smile. But as he drew closer, something in his expression made her stomach drop. Yes, I'm Emily Grant. You must be Harold. She extended her hand with a smile that felt increasingly forced. Harold Denton barely glanced at her outstretched hand. His eyes swept over her with the cold assessment of a man examining livestock, and what he saw apparently didn't meet his expectations. His nervous smile faded into something closer to disgust. "There's been a mistake," he said loudly, his voice carrying across the platform. Several people turned to watch, sensing drama unfolding. "I specifically requested a young, attractive bride. You're clearly past your prime, and your photograph must have been generous." Emily felt the blood drain from her face. Around them, conversations had stopped. She was acutely aware of the stares, the whispered comments, the barely concealed amusement of the onlookers. "I don't understand," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Your letters, you said, I've changed my mind." Harold cut her off, his voice growing louder with each word. "I won't be deceived into marriage with damaged goods. There's no arrangement, no agreement, and certainly no wedding. You can take the next train back to wherever you came from." The platform had gone completely silent now. Emily felt every pair of eyes on her, felt the heat of humiliation burning through her chest. Her carefully planned future crumbled around her feet like autumn leaves. "But I have nowhere to go," she managed, hating how small and broken her voice sounded. "I sold everything I had for the train fare. I can't—" "That's hardly my problem," Harold sneered. "Perhaps you should have been more honest in your correspondence. Good day, Miss Grant." He turned on his heel and strode away, leaving Emily standing alone on the platform with her single bag and the weight of everyone's stares. The whispers started immediately. "Can you believe that poor thing came all this way? Harold always was a particular sort. What's she going to do now?" Emily stood frozen, her mind reeling. The train that had brought her was already pulling away from the station heading back east. She had exactly $3.47 to her name, not nearly enough for return passage, even if she had somewhere to return to. The boarding house back in Ohio had already rented her room to someone else. She forced herself to move to walk away from the platform with what dignity she could muster. But where could she go? She knew no one in this town had no prospects. "No, ma'am. Look out." The shout came from somewhere to her left, but before she could react, something slammed into her from behind. Emily went sprawling face first into the dirt, her bag flying from her hands. Pain shot through her knees and palms as she scraped against the rough ground. Above her, she could hear men shouting the thunder of hooves and then a tremendous crash followed by splintering wood. She pushed herself up on her elbows, spitting dust from her mouth, and turned to see what had happened. A massive barrel, probably containing flour or grain, lay smashed to pieces not 3 feet from where she'd been standing. If she hadn't been knocked down, it would have crushed her completely. Her rescuer, whoever he was, had literally saved her life. "Are you hurt?" The voice was deep, roughened by sun and wind, with a slight drawl that spoke of Texas origins. Emily looked up to find herself staring into the most intense blue eyes she'd ever seen. The man kneeling beside her was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that needed cutting and a face that had been weathered by years of outdoor work. His clothes were dusty but well-made leather vest over a white shirt, dark pants, and boots that had seen plenty of use. I think I'm all right," she said, accepting his offered hand and allowing him to help her to her feet. Her knees wobbled slightly and his other hand came up to steady her elbow. "That was close," he said, his eyes scanning her for injuries. "Damn fool driving that wagon like he was running from the devil himself. Pardon my language, ma'am." "Thank you," Emily said suddenly, very aware of how she must look covered in dust, her hair coming loose from its pins, her dress torn at the knee. "You saved my life." "Jacob Carver," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "And you're the lady who just got herself publicly humiliated by Harold Denton." Emily felt her cheeks burn again. "I suppose the whole town saw that." "Most of it." His expression softened slightly. "Harold's a fool, if you don't mind me saying so. Any man who'd treat a lady like that in public isn't worth the dirt on your shoes." "Unfortunately, that doesn't solve my current predicament," Emily said, trying to keep her voice steady. She bent to retrieve her scattered belongings, and Jacob helped her, brushing dust off her carpet bag. "Which is?" Emily straightened, clutching her bag. There was something about this man, Jacob, that made her want to tell the truth instead of trying to maintain her dignity through lies. "I have nowhere to go and no money to get there," she said simply. "I sold everything I owned to come here believing I was going to be married. Now I'm stranded in a place where I know no one and have no prospects." Jacob studied her for a long moment, those blue eyes unreadable. Around them, the normal bustle of the train station had resumed, but Emily was acutely aware of the occasional glance thrown their way. "Can you cook?" he asked suddenly. Emily blinked, confused by the question. "Yes, I can cook. I can clean, men tend to garden care for livestock. I'm not helpless, Mr. Carver. I'm just temporarily without options. I run a ranch about 10 miles north of here, the Triple C, and lost my housekeeper last month when she decided to marry my foreman and move back to Kansas. Place has been falling apart without a woman's touch." He paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. "I'm not offering marriage, Miss Grant. I'm offering honest work for honest wages. Room and board plus $20 a month, 3-month trial period to see how we all get along." Emily stared at him. "You don't even know me. I know you've got grit enough to travel 1,000 miles alone to make a new life. I know you kept your dignity when Harold made a fool of himself. And I know you need help while I need someone to keep my ranch hands from living like animals." His mouth quirked up in what might have been a smile. "Seems like we might be able to help each other out. What exactly would you expect of me?" "Cooking, cleaning, mending, doctoring when needed. My men work hard, but they eat like they were raised by wolves, and their idea of housekeeping involves sweeping everything under the bed. I've got 12 hands year-round, more during roundup and branding season." Emily's mind raced. It wasn't the security she'd dreamed of, but it was infinitely better than being stranded with no prospects at all. And there was something about Jacob Carver that made her think he was a man of his word. 12 men, she asked, and you think one woman can manage all that? I think the right woman could manage a whole lot more than that, he said quietly. Question is, are you the right woman? Before Emily could answer, a commotion erupted near the mercantile across the street. Harold Denton's voice rose above the general noise, and both Emily and Jacob turned to look, told her plainly that there would be no wedding. The woman was clearly not what she represented herself to be in her letters. I won't be trapped into marriage by false pretenses. He was speaking to a small crowd that had gathered, apparently feeling the need to justify his public rejection of Emily. Several women in the group were nodding sympathetically, while the men looked uncomfortable with the whole situation. False pretenses. Emily repeated, her voice tight with anger. I never lied about anything in my letters. Harold's always been a jackass, Jacob said mildly. Inherited his daddy's store and thinks that makes him better than everybody else. You're well rid of him. Perhaps, but he's still destroying what little reputation I might have had in this town. Jacob's expression hardened as he listened to Harold's continued complaints. Stay here, he said, and started across the street toward the crowd. Mr. Carver, please don't. But he was already walking away, his long stride eating up the distance. Emily watched in fascination and growing alarm as Jacob approached the group. He was taller than most of the men there, and something about his presence made people step back slightly. Harold, Jacob said, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. Sounds like you're having some trouble with your manners. Harold turned his face flushing red when he saw Jacob. This doesn't concern you, Carver. This is a private matter. Doesn't seem very private when you're discussing it with half the town, Jacob replied calmly. Seems to me a gentleman would have handled his business quietly instead of trying to ruin a lady's reputation to make himself feel better about his own shortcomings. Now, see here. No, you see here. Jacob's voice dropped lower but somehow became more dangerous. Miss Grant is a lady who deserves to be treated with respect. If I hear you spreading lies about her or trying to damage her good name, you and I are going to have words, and you won't like the conversation. The crowd had gone silent again, sensing the tension crackling between the two men. Harold opened his mouth as if to argue, then seemed to think better of it when he met Jacob's steady gaze. Fine, Harold muttered. I've said my piece anyway. He pushed through the crowd and stalked away toward his store, leaving behind a buzz of excited whispers. Jacob stood there for another moment, letting his presence settle the matter, then turned and walked back to where Emily waited. You didn't have to do that, she said when he reached her. Yes, I did. His voice was matter-of-fact. A man who'd treat a woman like that in public will do worse when nobody's watching. Better to make it clear right from the start that it won't be tolerated. Emily studied his face, seeing something there that made her pulse quicken. This was a man who would stand up for what he believed in, who would protect those under his care. It was more than Harold Denton had ever offered her, even in his most flowery letters. Your offer, she said carefully. It's strictly business, strictly business. You'd have your own room, your privacy respected. Any man who bothers you would answer to me personally. And after 3 months, we'd discuss terms for a longer arrangement if things work out, or I'd help you find other employment if they don't. Either way, you'd have time to get your bearings and figure out what you want to do with your life. Emily looked around the dusty street at the rough buildings and rougher men, at the vast sky stretching endlessly overhead. It was nothing like the life she'd imagined for herself, but then again, neither was being publicly humiliated and left stranded. All right, she said, decision made. I accept your offer, Mr. Carver. Jacob, he corrected. If you're going to be working at the Triple C, we might as well dispense with the formalities. Emily, she replied, feeling oddly as if she were stepping off a cliff into unknown territory. Good. Let's get you out to the ranch before it gets too late. I've got supplies to load and then we can head out. As Jacob gathered his purchases, sacks of flour and sugar coffee ammunition and other necessities, Emily found herself studying him covertly. He moved with the easy confidence of a man comfortable with his place in the world, but there was something else there too. A watchfulness, as if he were constantly alert for danger. How long have you had the ranch? She asked as they loaded the supplies into his wagon. Going on 8 years now. Bought it from a man who was heading back east after his wife died. Built it up from nothing, just a cabin and a few head of cattle. Now I've got 2,000 acres and some of the best grazing land in the territory. It must be a hard life. Jacob paused in his loading and looked at her seriously. It is. Winters can be brutal. Summers are hot and dry, and there's always something trying to kill your cattle wolves, rustlers, disease drought. It's not a life for everyone. But you love it. It wasn't a question, and Jacob didn't treat it like one. I do. There's something about working land that's yours, building something that'll last, being your own man. It gets in your blood. They finished loading in comfortable silence, and Jacob helped Emily up onto the wagon seat. As they drove through town, she was aware of the curious stares following them. By evening, everyone in Copper Falls would know that Jacob Carver had taken in the woman Harold Denton had rejected. Let them talk, Jacob said, apparently reading her thoughts. Small towns thrive on gossip. Give them a week and they'll find something else to chew over. The road to the Triple C wound through rolling hills covered in prairie grass that moved like ocean waves in the wind. As they traveled, Jacob pointed out landmarks, a creek that provided water for the cattle, a stand of cottonwoods that served as a windbreak, the boundaries of his land marked by fence posts and wire. How many men did you say work for you? Emily asked, suddenly nervous about the reality of what she'd agreed to. 12 year-round, good men mostly. They work hard and they're loyal, but they've been living like bachelors too long. The bunkhouse is starting to smell like a bear den, and I caught 2 of them trying to cook beans in a coffee pot last week. Despite her nervousness, Emily found herself smiling. That bad? Worse. Cookie, that's our cook, broke his leg in a fall from his horse 3 weeks ago. We've been taking turns trying to feed ourselves, and it's been educational. Educational. Charlie tried to make biscuits and created something that could probably stop a bullet. Tom burned the bacon so bad we had to scrape it off the pan with a knife. And yesterday I caught young Billy trying to fry eggs in bacon grease that was hot enough to melt lead. Emily laughed, the first genuine laugh she'd had since stepping off the train. It sounds like you need more than a housekeeper. You need a miracle worker. I'm hoping you'll do, Jacob said, glancing at her with something that might have been approval. A woman who can travel 1,000 miles alone to start a new life probably has enough backbone to handle a bunch of overgrown cowboys. As they crested a hill, the Triple C spread out below them, and Emily felt her breath catch. The ranch house was larger than she'd expected, a 2-story log structure with a wide front porch and stone chimney. Outbuildings dotted the area around it, a barn bunkhouse corral and several smaller structures she couldn't identify. Cattle grazed in the distance, dark spots against the golden grass. It's beautiful, she said softly. It's home, Jacob replied, and she could hear the pride in his voice. As they pulled up in front of the house, men began emerging from various buildings. Tall men, short men, young and old, all of them weathered by sun and wind and hard work. They gathered around the wagon with undisguised curiosity, their eyes fixed on Emily. Boys, Jacob said, climbing down from the wagon, I want you to meet Miss Emily Grant. She's going to be our new housekeeper. A general murmur of approval ran through the group, along with several hat tips and mumbled greetings. Emily found herself being helped down from the wagon by a grizzled man with kind eyes and a salt and pepper beard. Name's Tom Bradley, ma'am. Been the foreman here for 6 years, and I can tell you right now we sure are glad to see you. Thank you, Mr. Bradley. Just Tom, ma'am. We don't stand much on ceremony out here. The other men introduced themselves, Charlie the blacksmith, who doubled as a handyman, Billy, barely 18 and eager as a puppy, Sam, a quiet man with intelligent eyes who served as the horse wrangler, and several others whose names she knew she'd never remember all at once. I know it's a lot of names, Jacob said, apparently reading her expression. You'll sort them out soon enough. Boys, Miss Grant has had a long day, so let's get her settled. Tom? Would you help me unload the supplies, Charlie? See if you can round up something decent for supper that won't poison our new housekeeper on her first night. As the men scattered to their tasks, Jacob led Emily up the front steps and into the house. The front door opened directly into a large main room that served as both parlor and dining area. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall, and Emily could see doorways leading to what must be the kitchen and other rooms. It's not fancy, Jacob said suddenly, seeming almost embarrassed by his home. Emily looked around, taking in the details, good furniture that was obviously well made, but covered in dust windows that hadn't been properly cleaned in months. and a general air of neglect that spoke of men living without a woman's touch. "It has good bones," she said diplomatically. "It just needs some attention." Jacob showed her through the house, the kitchen with its large cookstove and pump that brought water directly inside a small parlor off the main room, and upstairs 4 bedrooms. He stopped at the door to the smallest room at the back of the house. "This would be yours," he said, opening the door to reveal a simply furnished space with a single bed dresser and washstand. A window looked out over the ranch yard toward the distant mountains. Emily set her carpet bag on the bed and looked around her new home. It was smaller than her room back in Ohio had been, but it was clean and private, and most importantly, it was hers for as long as she could prove herself worthy of it. "I'll leave you to get settled," Jacob said from the doorway. "Supper's usually around 6, but tonight we'll make it whenever Charlie manages to put something together that won't kill us all." After he left, Emily sat on the narrow bed and tried to process everything that had happened. This morning she'd awakened on the train full of nervous excitement about meeting her intended husband. Now, she was in a strange house surrounded by strange men, with only the uncertain prospect of 3 months' employment standing between her and complete destitution. But as she looked out the window at the vast landscape stretching toward the horizon, she felt something she hadn't expected: hope. This wasn't the life she'd planned, but it was a chance to prove herself, to build something new from the ashes of her dreams. And Jacob Carver. There was something about him that made her pulse quicken in a way Harold Denton's letters never had. The way he'd stood up to Harold, the easy authority he commanded among his men, the kindness he'd shown a stranger in desperate need. These were the actions of a man worth knowing. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. "Miss Grant, ma'am?" It was Billy's young voice, nervous and polite. "Yes." "Charlie says supper's ready, ma'am. Nothing fancy, just beans and bacon and biscuits, but it's edible." "I'll be right down." Emily quickly tidied her appearance as best she could and made her way downstairs. The main room had been transformed into a dining hall with several rough tables pushed together and chairs gathered from various parts of the house. The men were already seated, but they all stood when she entered, a courtesy she hadn't expected from a group of cowboys. Jacob appeared from the kitchen carrying a large pot, followed by Charlie with a plate of biscuits that actually looked edible. "Hope you're hungry," Jacob said, setting the pot on the table. "Charlie outdid himself tonight." As Emily took her seat, Jacob had placed her at one end of the long table with himself at the other. She realized this was her first real meal as a member of the Triple C family. The food was simple but well prepared, and the conversation was easier than she'd expected. The men were curious about her journey west, respectful in their questions, and surprisingly well-mannered. "Where'd you come from, Miss Grant?" asked Sam, the horse wrangler. "Ohio originally. My father had a small farm there." "What made you decide to come west?" This from Tom, the foreman. Emily hesitated, glancing at Jacob. He gave her a small nod, as if to say she could tell as much or as little as she wanted. "My father passed away last year," she said simply. "The farm was lost to debts, and I decided it was time for a fresh start." It wasn't the whole truth, but it wasn't a lie either. The men nodded, understanding. Many of them had probably come west for similar reasons. "Well, we're mighty glad you're here," said Charlie. "Been eating my own cooking for 3 weeks now, and I was starting to think I might poison myself." "The cooking's not that bad," Billy protested. "Remember that stew you made last week? That was pretty good." "That wasn't stew, son. That was an accident that happened to be edible." The laughter that followed was warm and inclusive, and Emily found herself relaxing for the first time since stepping off the train. These were good men, rough around the edges perhaps, but fundamentally decent. She could work with them. After supper, the men drifted away to their evening tasks, checking on the horses, making repairs, or simply sitting on the bunkhouse porch enjoying the cool night air. Jacob lingered as Emily began clearing the table. "You don't have to start tonight," he said. "You've had a long day." "I'd rather keep busy," Emily replied, stacking plates. "It helps me think." Jacob picked up the empty pot and followed her into the kitchen. "What do you think of the place?" Emily looked around the kitchen, taking inventory. It was well equipped, but obviously neglected, dirty dishes stacked everywhere, the floor in need of a good scrubbing, and the stove coated with grease and spilled food. "I think it has potential," she said diplomatically. "How long did you say it's been since you had a proper housekeeper?" 6 weeks. Maria left to get married, and we've been making do ever since." "Making do," Emily repeated, running her finger along a counter and showing him the dust. "I can see that." Jacob had the grace to look embarrassed. We're better at running cattle than running a household. Fortunately, I'm better at running a household than I am at running cattle. We should complement each other nicely." As they worked together to clean up from supper, Emily found herself stealing glances at Jacob. He moved through the kitchen with easy familiarity, clearly comfortable in his own home, but she could see the relief in his eyes at having someone competent taking charge of the domestic duties. "Tell me about your men," she said as she pumped water into the wash basin. "What should I know about them?" Jacob leaned against the counter, considering. "They're good men, all of them. Tom's been with me almost since the beginning, solid as granite and twice as reliable. Charlie came from Texas with me when I first bought this place. He's gruff, but he'd give you the shirt off his back if you needed it. And the younger ones. Billy's green but eager. He came to us last spring fresh off the farm in Iowa. Sam knows horses better than most people know their own families. The others are steady hands. They do their work, don't cause trouble, and earn their pay." Emily nodded, filing away the information. "What about dangers? You mentioned wolves and rustlers earlier." Jacob's expression grew serious. "Wolves are mostly a winter problem, and we haven't had trouble with rustlers in over a year. But this is still frontier country, Emily. There are risks." "What kind of risks?" "Weather mostly. Flash floods, blizzards, tornadoes. Accidents happen when you're working with large animals and dangerous equipment, and there are other elements that sometimes cause problems." Something in his tone made Emily look up from the dishes. "What kind of other elements?" Jacob was quiet for a long moment, clearly debating how much to tell her. "There's a man named Silas Crowley who owns the biggest spread in the county. He's been trying to buy out smaller ranchers for years, sometimes using methods that aren't entirely legal. And he wants your land. He's made offers. I've turned them down." Emily sensed there was more to the story, but she also sensed that Jacob wasn't ready to share it yet. That was fine. She was a stranger here, and trust had to be earned. They finished the dishes in comfortable silence, and Jacob walked her to the foot of the stairs. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for everything today. For defending me, for offering me work, for giving me a chance." "Thank you for taking it," Jacob replied. "I have a feeling the Triple C is going to be a better place with you here." As Emily climbed the stairs to her room, she felt lighter than she had in months. Yes, this was a risk. Living alone among 12 men in the middle of nowhere, depending on the kindness of a stranger, building her future on uncertain ground. But it was also an opportunity. She prepared for bed by the light of a single candle, listening to the sounds of the ranch settling down for the night, low voices from the bunkhouse, the distant lowing of cattle, the whisper of wind through the grass. It was so different from the sounds of her childhood home, but somehow it felt right. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests of her ability to prove herself worthy of Jacob's trust. But tonight, for the first time in longer than she could remember, Emily Grant felt like she was exactly where she needed to be. Outside her window, the Montana sky stretched endlessly overhead, stars scattered like diamonds across black velvet. Somewhere out there was the life she'd dreamed of, not the safe, predictable existence she'd thought she wanted, but something bigger, more challenging, more real. And somewhere downstairs was a man whose blue eyes held secrets and whose quiet strength made her feel safer than Harold Denton's flowery promises ever had. Emily blew out her candle and settled into her narrow bed, listening to the night sounds of her new home. Tomorrow would bring whatever it brought, but tonight she was exactly where she belonged. The last thing she heard before sleep took her was the sound of Jacob's boots on the front porch as he made his final rounds, checking that all was secure. Even in sleep, she found comfort in knowing he was there, standing guard over the Triple C and everyone within its boundaries. Her dreams were filled with endless sky and the sound of wind through grass, and for the first time in months, she slept without fear. Emily woke before dawn to the sound of boots on the front porch and low voices drifting through her window. She dressed quickly in her plainest work dress, a sturdy brown cotton that could withstand whatever the day might bring, and made her way downstairs to find the kitchen already showing signs of the men's attempts at breakfast. Coffee grounds were scattered across the counter, eggshells littered the floor, and something that might once have been bacon lay charred in a pan on the stove. Charlie stood in the middle of the chaos, looking defeated. "Morning, Charlie," Emily said, rolling up her sleeves. "Rough start to the day." "Miss Grant, I'm purely sorry about this mess. Tried to get breakfast going before you came down, but I swear this stove has a mind of its own." Emily surveyed the damage with the practiced eye of someone who had been managing kitchens since she was 12 years old. No harm done. Why don't you get the coffee started properly while I see what we can salvage? Within minutes, she had the charred pan soaking fresh bacon sizzling and biscuit dough ready for the oven. The coffee grounds were swept up, the eggshells disposed of, and the kitchen began to take on the organized efficiency that had been missing for weeks. Jacob appeared in the doorway, drawn by the smell of properly cooked food. His dark hair was damp from washing, and his blue eyes held a mixture of surprise and approval as he took in the transformed kitchen. "Something smells like actual food," he said, accepting the cup of coffee Emily handed him. "Charlie had everything well in hand," Emily said diplomatically. "I just helped organize a bit." Charlie snorted. "She's being kind, boss. I made a mess and she fixed it. Woman's got magic in her hands when it comes to cooking." As if summoned by the smell, more men began filtering into the kitchen. Tom, Sam, Billy, and several others whose names Emily was still learning. They moved with the careful politeness of men unused to having a lady in their midst. But she could see the genuine appreciation in their eyes as she loaded their plates with bacon, eggs, and golden biscuits. "Ma'am, these biscuits are better than my mama used to make," Billy said around a mouthful of food. "And she could cook like nobody's business." "Thank you, Billy. There's plenty more where those came from." Tom Bradley studied her as he ate, his weathered face thoughtful. "Miss Grant, you mind if I ask you something?" "Of course not." "You ever worked on a ranch before? Because you seem mighty comfortable for someone who just got here yesterday." Emily poured herself a cup of coffee and considered her answer. These men deserved honesty, even if it wasn't the whole truth. "My father raised me to be useful," she said finally. "I've been managing a household since I was 12, caring for him after my mother died. I know how to work hard, how to make do with what I have, and how to keep things running smoothly. As for ranching specifically, well, I suppose I'll learn." "Fair enough." Tom nodded. "If you need anything explained or want to know how things work around here, just ask. We're all happy to help." After breakfast, as the men headed out to their various tasks, Jacob lingered in the kitchen. "You've already made quite an impression," he said, watching Emily begin the process of organizing the pantry. "They're good men. They just needed someone to take charge of the domestic side of things." "It's more than that." Jacob leaned against the doorframe, studying her. "Tom Bradley's worked ranches all his life, and he doesn't give his approval lightly. If he's willing to help you learn the business, it means he sees something in you worth investing in." Emily felt a warm glow at the praise, but she kept her voice practical. "What would you like me to focus on today, besides meals, I mean?" "Whatever you think needs the most attention. This house hasn't had proper care in weeks, and I trust your judgment about what's important." After Jacob left to join his men, Emily stood in the kitchen and planned her campaign. The house was large enough to be overwhelming if she tried to tackle everything at once, but she'd learned long ago that the secret to managing any situation was to break it down into manageable pieces. She started with the kitchen, scrubbing every surface until it gleamed, organizing the pantry and taking inventory of supplies. By mid-morning, she had a clear picture of what they had, what they needed, and what could be improved. The sound of approaching horses interrupted her work, and she looked out the window to see 3 riders approaching the house. They weren't Triple C men. She was already learning to recognize Jacob's crew by their horses and riding styles. These men rode with the loose confidence of those accustomed to getting their way, and something about their bearing made Emily uneasy. Jacob emerged from the barn to meet them, and even from a distance Emily could see the tension in his posture. She moved closer to the window, instinctively wanting to hear what was being said. The lead rider was a tall man with silver hair and expensive clothes that marked him as someone with money and power. When he spoke, his voice carried clearly in the still air. "Carver, I hear you've taken in a woman. Harold Denton's cast-off bride, from what I'm told." "News travels fast, Crowley." Jacob's voice was level, but Emily could hear the warning underneath. So this was Silas Crowley, the man Jacob had mentioned with such careful neutrality. "It does indeed. I also hear she's living in your house alone with you and your men. That's quite a scandal, even by frontier standards." "Miss Grant is my housekeeper. She has her own room and is treated with complete respect by everyone on this ranch." Crowley's laugh was unpleasant. "I'm sure she is. But you know how people talk, Jacob. A woman in her situation, abandoned by her intended husband, taking up with the first man to offer her shelter. Well, it doesn't look good." Emily felt her face burn with anger. She'd been on the ranch less than 24 hours and already people were questioning her reputation. "What people think is their business," Jacob said coldly. "What happens on my ranch is mine." Of course. I'm just saying if you ever find the situation uncomfortable, I'd be happy to help the lady find alternative arrangements. I'm always in need of domestic help at my place." The offer hung in the air like a threat, and Emily felt a chill run down her spine. There was something in Crowley's tone that suggested his idea of domestic help might involve duties beyond cooking and cleaning. "Miss Grant is perfectly satisfied with her current situation," Jacob said, his voice dropping to a dangerous level. "And I'm perfectly satisfied with her work. Is there something else you needed, Silas?" "Just being neighborly, though I do hope you'll reconsider my standing offer for this place. The CCC would fit nicely with my other holdings, and I'm prepared to be quite generous." My answer hasn't changed. "Pity. This is hard country, Jacob. Accidents happen, equipment fails, cattle get sick. Sometimes a man finds himself in a position where he needs to make difficult choices." The threat was subtle, but unmistakable, and Emily saw Jacob's hand drift toward the gun on his hip. "Is that a prediction, Silas?" "Just an observation about the nature of ranching." Crowley gathered his reins, preparing to leave. "Give my regards to the housekeeper." The three men rode away, but the tension they'd brought lingered in the air like smoke. Emily watched Jacob stand motionless for a long moment, his hand still resting on his gun before he turned and headed back toward the barn. She returned to her work, but her mind kept circling back to the conversation she'd overheard. It was clear that Crowley wanted the CCC, and equally clear that he wasn't above using intimidation to get it. The reference to her own situation had been calculated to make both her and Jacob uncomfortable, to plant seeds of doubt about the propriety of their arrangement. When lunchtime came, Emily noticed that Jacob was quieter than usual, his blue eyes distant and thoughtful. The men sensed his mood and kept their conversation subdued, but she could feel their curious glances in her direction. After the meal, as she was cleaning up, Tom Bradley approached her. "Miss Grant, can I have a word?" She followed him onto the front porch where they could speak privately. Tom's weathered face was serious as he studied the horizon where Crowley's men had disappeared. "You saw those visitors this morning?" "I did. Mr. Crowley seemed unpleasant," Tom snorted. "That's one word for him. Miss Grant, I'm going to speak plain because I think you need to know what you've walked into here." Emily set down the dish towel she'd been holding and gave him her full attention. "I'm listening." "Silas Crowley owns about half the county and he wants to own the other half. He's been pressuring smaller ranchers to sell out, and when they won't, bad things start happening. Cattle go missing, equipment gets sabotaged, men get hurt in accidents. And he wants the CCC. He's wanted it for 3 years now. Jacob's refused every offer and Crowley's getting impatient. Having you here gives him another angle to work." Emily felt her stomach tighten. "Because of my reputation. Because people will talk, and talk can be dangerous in a small community. If Crowley can convince folks that Jacob's lost his moral compass, it weakens his standing with the other ranchers, makes him look like someone who can't be trusted. Then perhaps I should leave." The words came out before Emily could stop them, and she immediately regretted the impulse. Tom's eyes sharpened. "Is that what you want?" Emily looked out across the ranch at the cattle grazing peacefully, at the men going about their work with quiet efficiency, at the house that was already beginning to feel like home. "No," she said quietly. "It's not." "Good. Because running away would just prove Crowley right. The best thing you can do is exactly what you're doing, prove that you're a respectable woman doing honest work. And if that's not enough," Tom's smile was grim, "then we deal with whatever comes next when it gets here. But don't you worry about Crowley, Miss Grant. The CCC has survived worse than the likes of him." That afternoon, Emily threw herself into her work with renewed determination. She tackled the main room, moving furniture to sweep and scrub the floors, beating dust from rugs and polishing every surface until it gleamed. The physical labor helped burn away her anger and anxiety, replacing them with a sense of purpose. As she worked, the men found excuses to pass through the house, ostensibly on various errands, but clearly checking on her. Their protective instincts touched her more than she wanted to admit. These rough cowboys were treating her like a sister, and their unspoken support gave her strength. Billy appeared in the doorway as she was wrestling with a particularly heavy chair. Ma'am, let me help you with that, he said, rushing forward. Thank you, Billy. I can manage most things, but some of this furniture weighs more than I do. As they moved the chair together, Billy glanced around the transformed room. Sure looks different in here. Feels more like a real home. That's the idea. A place should feel welcoming when the men come in from a hard day's work. Billy nodded sagely, though at 18 he had limited experience with such matters. My ma always said a house isn't a home without a woman's touch. Guess she was right. Your mother sounds like a wise woman. She was. Lost her 2 years ago to fever. That's when I decided to head west, try to make something of myself. Emily saw the pain in his young face and felt her heart squeeze. I'm sure she'd be proud of the man you're becoming. I hope so, ma'am. I surely do hope so. As evening approached, Emily began preparing dinner beef stew with vegetables from the ranch's small garden, fresh bread and apple pie made from dried fruit she'd found in the pantry. The kitchen filled with rich smells that drew the men like moths to flame. Lord have mercy, Charlie said, appearing in the doorway. Is that actual pie I smell? It is indeed, though you'll have to wait until after dinner to have any. Ma'am, I think I might cry. It's been so long since I had real pie I was starting to think it was just a beautiful dream. Jacob arrived as Emily was putting the finishing touches on the meal. He paused in the kitchen doorway, taking in the scene, Emily moving efficiently between stove and counter, the table set with actual care instead of just thrown together the warm light from the oil lamps making everything glow golden. Smells like heaven in here, he said softly. Just simple ranch cooking, Emily replied, but she felt pleased by his obvious appreciation. Emily. The use of her first name made her look up, and she saw something serious in his expression. I need to tell you about this morning, about Crowley's visit. I heard most of it from the kitchen window. Jacob's jaw tightened. Then you know he's going to try to use your presence here against us. Tom explained the situation to me this afternoon. Emily met his gaze steadily. I'm not going anywhere, Jacob. Not unless you want me to go. Something shifted in his blue eyes. Surprised relief, and something else she couldn't quite identify. I don't want you to go, but I need you to understand that things might get difficult. Crowley doesn't give up easily. Neither do I. Emily turned back to the stove, but she could feel Jacob's gaze on her back. I've been taking care of myself for a long time. I'm not afraid of gossip or small-minded people. It might be more than gossip. Emily turned to face him fully. What do you mean? Jacob was quiet for a long moment, clearly debating how much to tell her. Crowley's methods aren't always legal. If he can't get what he wants through pressure and intimidation, he's been known to escalate. Escalate how? Accidents, equipment failures. Sometimes his men get it drunk and cause trouble in town, making sure everyone knows whose side they're on. Emily absorbed this information, understanding now why Jacob had been so tense all day. Are you asking me to leave? No. The answer came quickly, emphatically. I'm asking you to be careful. To stay close to the house when you're alone, to let one of the men know if you need to go anywhere. I understand. Do you? Because this isn't just about protecting you, Emily. If something happened to you while you were under my roof, I'd never forgive myself. The intensity in his voice made her pulse quicken. There was something personal in his concern, something that went beyond the obligations of an employer to his employee. Nothing's going to happen to me, she said softly. I'm tougher than I look. I'm beginning to realize that. Dinner was a lively affair, with the men praising Emily's cooking and sharing stories of their day's work. The conversation flowed easily, and Emily found herself laughing at Charlie's tall tales and Billy's earnest questions about everything from horse training to the best way to repair a broken fence post. Miss Grant, Sam said as they were finishing the main course, I was wondering if you might know anything about doctoring. We're pretty isolated out here, and sometimes a man needs more help than what's in the medicine chest. I know some basic nursing, Emily replied. I took care of my father during his final illness, and I've helped with births and injuries in our community back home. Why do you ask? Well, Cookie, our regular cook, is laid up with that broken leg, and he's not healing as fast as he should be. Might be good for someone with a woman's touch to take a look at him. Emily glanced at Jacob, who nodded. Cookie's staying in the small cabin behind the bunkhouse. We've been doing what we can, but none of us knows much about nursing. I'd be happy to look at him tomorrow, Emily said. What kind of break was it? Horse fell on him, Tom explained. Broke his leg just below the knee. Doc in town said it should heal fine, but it's been 3 weeks and Cookie's still in considerable pain. Emily nodded, already mentally going through the supplies she'd need. I'll need to see the injury and assess how it's healing. We might need to send for the doctor again if there are complications. After dinner, as the men settled on the front porch to enjoy the cool evening air, Emily found herself standing in the kitchen doorway looking out at the scene. It felt natural, domestic in a way her life had never been before. These men had accepted her not just as their housekeeper, but as part of their family. Jacob appeared beside her, his presence somehow both comforting and unsettling. Penny, for your thoughts. I was just thinking how different this is from what I expected when I got on that train in Ohio. Yeah. Good different or bad different? Emily considered the question seriously. Different. I thought I was coming west to be a wife, to have security and a predictable life. Instead, I'm living in a house full of cowboys, facing down threats from powerful enemies and feeling more alive than I have in years. Any regrets? She turned to look at him, taking in the strong line of his jaw, the way the evening light caught in his dark hair, the steady strength that radiated from him like heat from a fire. No, she said quietly. No regrets. They stood in comfortable silence for a few minutes, listening to the low murmur of conversation from the porch and the distant lowing of cattle settling down for the night. Emily, Jacob said finally, his voice careful. About what Crowley said this morning. What about it? People are going to talk about you living here, about our arrangement. It might make things difficult for you. Emily straightened her shoulders. Let them talk. I know who I am and what I'm doing here. That's all that matters. It matters to me that your reputation stays intact. My reputation survived being publicly rejected by Harold Denton. I think it can survive a few gossips questioning my living arrangements. Jacob smiled, the first real smile she'd seen from him all day. You're stronger than most people give you credit for, aren't you? I've had to be. Well, for what it's worth, I'm glad you're here. This place feels more like a home than it has in years. Emily felt warmth spread through her chest at his words. Thank you. That means more to me than you know. As the evening wound down and the men began drifting toward the bunkhouse, Emily cleaned up from dinner and prepared the kitchen for the next day. Jacob lingered, ostensibly helping, but mostly just watching her work with an expression she couldn't quite read. I should probably ask, she said as she dried the last of the dishes. What exactly are the boundaries of my position here? What am I responsible for, and what falls outside my duties? Anything that keeps the house running and the men fed, Jacob replied. Beyond that, use your judgment. If you see something that needs doing and you're willing to do it, consider it part of your job. And the men, how do I handle any difficulties that might arise? Jacob's expression grew serious. What kind of difficulties? I'm a single woman living among 12 men. I'd be naive to think that might not create complications eventually. Any man who bothers you answers to me personally, Jacob said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. And I've made that clear to everyone here. But if someone does cross a line, you tell me immediately. I can handle myself. I'm sure you can, but you shouldn't have to. Emily studied his face, seeing the protective instinct that ran bone deep in this man. It was comforting and slightly overwhelming at the same time. Understood, she said finally. As they finished closing up the house for the night, Emily became acutely aware of their proximity in the small kitchen. Jacob was a large man, and when he moved past her to bank the fire in the stove, she caught the scent of leather and soap, and something uniquely him. It made her pulse quicken in a way that was both thrilling and dangerous. Good night, Emily, he said softly, pausing at the kitchen door. Good night, Jacob. After he left, Emily made her way upstairs to her room, her mind churning with everything that had happened during her first full day at the CCC. She'd proven herself in the kitchen, begun to establish her place in the household hierarchy, and learned that her presence here was going to attract exactly the kind of attention she'd hoped to avoid. But she'd also discovered something unexpected. She was genuinely happy here, happier than she'd been in months, maybe years. The work was satisfying. The men treated her with respect and kindness, and Jacob was becoming a problem. Not because he was unkind or inappropriate, quite the opposite. He was everything Harold Denton had pretended to be in his letters: strong, honorable, protective, genuinely concerned for her welfare. And unlike Harold, Jacob's actions matched his words. The attraction she felt toward him was dangerous, for a dozen reasons, not least of which was that she was completely dependent on his goodwill for her survival. She couldn't afford to complicate their working relationship with romantic feelings, especially not when those feelings were almost certainly one-sided. Emily undressed and prepared for bed, forcing herself to focus on practical matters. Tomorrow she would check on Cookie's injury, continue organizing the house, and begin planning for the increased workload that would come with roundup season. She would prove herself indispensable through her competence and reliability, not through any personal connection to the ranch's owner. But as she lay in her narrow bed listening to the night sounds of the ranch, she couldn't stop thinking about the way Jacob had looked at her in the kitchen, or the warmth in his voice when he'd said the house felt like a home with her in it. Outside, a coyote called to its mate, the sound wild and lonely in the darkness. Emily closed her eyes and tried to sleep, but her dreams were filled with blue eyes and gentle hands, and the dangerous possibility that maybe Jacob Carver was beginning to see her as more than just his housekeeper. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, it filled her with a hope she couldn't afford to feel and didn't know how to suppress. Morning came with the sound of raised voices from the direction of the bunkhouse, and Emily hurried to dress before making her way downstairs. Through the kitchen window, she could see several of the men clustered around the small cabin where Cookie was recuperating, their faces grim with concern. Jacob emerged from the cabin just as Emily stepped onto the back porch, and the expression on his face made her stomach clench with worry. "How bad?" she called out, not bothering with pleasantries. "Bad enough. Cookie's been burning with fever all night, and his leg." Jacob shook his head. "I think you'd better take a look." Emily gathered supplies from the medicine chest: clean bandages, carbolic acid, laudanum for pain, and followed Jacob to the cabin. The smell hit her as soon as she stepped inside, the sickly sweet odor of infection that she remembered all too well from her father's final days. Cookie lay on a narrow cot, his face flushed with fever and slick with sweat. The injured leg was swollen grotesquely beneath the blanket, and when Emily gently pulled back the covering, she had to steel herself against the sight that greeted her. The break itself appeared to be healing, but the skin around the injury site was angry red and hot to the touch. Worse, she could see telltale red streaks beginning to creep up his leg, the unmistakable sign of blood poisoning. "When did this start?" she asked, her voice carefully controlled. "Yesterday afternoon," he said. "His leg was hurting more than usual," Tom replied from the doorway. "By evening, he was talking out of his head with fever." Emily pressed her lips together, thinking rapidly. She'd seen this before, knew what it meant, and how quickly it could turn deadly. "We need to get the doctor out here immediately. This isn't something we can treat with home remedies." "Doc's in Billings until tomorrow," Jacob said grimly. "Won't be back until evening at the earliest." "Then we'll have to do what we can until he gets here." Emily rolled up her sleeves, her mind already cataloging what needed to be done. "I'll need hot water, clean rags, and someone to help me hold him down when I clean the wound." For the next several hours, Emily worked with steady determination to fight the infection that was slowly killing Cookie. She cleaned and dressed the wound, forcing herself to remain calm, despite the man's delirious struggles and cries of pain. Billy and Sam took turns helping her hold him still, while she worked, their young faces pale but determined. "Is he going to make it?" Billy whispered during one of Cookie's quieter moments. "I don't know," Emily answered honestly. "But we're going to do everything we can to give him the best chance." As the morning wore on, more problems began to surface. Charlie came racing in from the eastern pasture with news that a section of fence had been cut during the night, and nearly 50 head of cattle were missing. "Cut?" Jacob's voice was dangerously quiet. "You're sure it was cut and not just broken? Clean as a whistle, boss. Someone used wire cutters, no doubt about it." Emily saw the muscle in Jacob's jaw jump as he processed this information. "Crowley's making his move," she said quietly, and Jacob nodded grimly. "Tom, take Sam and Billy and ride the fence line. See if you can track where they took the cattle. Charlie, you and the others start checking the rest of our boundaries. If they hit us once, they might try again." As the men scattered to their tasks, Emily found herself alone with the feverish Cookie and a growing sense of unease. The timing of the cattle theft coming so soon after Crowley's threatening visit couldn't be coincidental. She was changing Cookie's bandages when she heard the sound of approaching horses. Through the small window, she could see 3 riders coming up the main road, Triple C men, and not riding with the casual confidence of neighbors, making a social call. Emily quickly finished securing the bandage and stepped outside, wiping her hands on her apron. The riders pulled up near the main house, and she recognized one of them from Crowley's entourage the day before. "Afternoon, miss," the lead rider said, touching his hat in a mockery of politeness. "We're looking for Jacob Carver, important business." "Mr. Carver is out on the range," Emily replied, keeping her voice steady despite the way the men's eyes raked over her. "I can take a message." "No message, we'll wait." "I'm afraid that won't be convenient. As you can see, we have a medical emergency here and I have work to do." The man's smile was unpleasant. "That's too bad." Herd Cookie took a turn for the worse. Funny how accidents seem to be happening all around the Triple C lately. Emily felt ice form in her stomach at the casual way he referenced Cookie's condition. "What do you want?" "Just to have a friendly conversation with Carver about some cattle that seem to have wandered off his property. Cattle have a way of getting confused about boundaries sometimes. I'm sure Mr. Carver will be very interested in discussing his missing cattle with the appropriate authorities." "Oh, I don't think involving the sheriff will be necessary. This is just a neighborly matter between ranchers." Emily was formulating a response when the sound of galloping horses announced Jacob's return. He rode hard into the yard with Tom beside him, both men's faces grim with purpose. Emily saw Jacob's hand move instinctively toward his gun when he spotted Crowley's men. "Gentlemen," Jacob said, dismounting with careful deliberation, "to what do I owe the pleasure?" "We came to talk about some cattle." The spokesman replied, "Seems you've lost some livestock." "I have indeed. 50 head taken from my eastern pasture sometime during the night. You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you?" "Can't say that I do, but I might have some information that could help you recover them." Emily watched the careful dance of threat and counter-threat, understanding that much more than cattle was being negotiated here. These men were testing Jacob's resolve, probing for weakness. "I'm listening," Jacob said. "Well, it seems these particular cattle were found on land that Mr. Crowley has a legitimate claim to. There's been some confusion about the boundary lines in that area." "No confusion at all," Jacob replied coldly. "The survey markers are clear and the deed is registered with the county." Funny thing about survey markers, they have a way of moving sometimes, and deeds, well, paperwork can be complicated. Emily saw Tom's hand drift toward his gun and the tension in the yard ratcheted up another notch. She realized that this confrontation could easily turn violent, and with most of Jacob's men scattered across the ranch, they were outnumbered. "If Mr. Crowley has a legitimate claim to that land, he can take it up with the courts," Jacob said. "Until then, I expect my cattle returned immediately." "Now that might be difficult. You see, Mr. Crowley's concerned about the atmosphere around here lately. Having an unmarried woman living in a house full of men, well, it sets a bad example for the community." Emily felt her cheeks burn with anger. But before she could speak, Jacob stepped forward, his voice dropping to a dangerous level. "What happens on my ranch is none of Crowley's business. Miss Grant is a respectable woman doing honest work, and anyone who suggests otherwise will answer to me personally." "Oh, I'm sure she's respectable," the man said with a leer that made Emily's skin crawl. "But you know how people talk. Might be better for everyone if she found more appropriate employment." "The only thing that would be better for everyone is if you got off my land before I decide you're trespassing." The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring, and Emily could feel violence hanging in the air like smoke. Then from inside the cabin came the sound of Cookie crying out in delirium, his voice carrying clearly across the yard. The distraction was momentary, but it was enough to break the spell. Crowley's man gathered his reins and backed his horse a few steps. "You think about what I said, Carver, about boundaries and responsibilities. A man's got to consider what's best for everyone involved." They rode away, but their threat lingered like a bad taste in the air. Emily found herself shaking slightly from the combination of anger and adrenaline. "Are you all right?" Jacob asked, moving to her side. "I'm fine, but they know about Cookie's condition, Jacob. They knew he was worse before anyone rode out to tell you." Jacob's face darkened. Someone's been watching us. Probably have been since yesterday. Tom spat in the dirt. Bastards are playing games with us, boss, testing to see how we'll react. Let them test, Jacob said grimly. They'll find out soon enough what kind of men they're dealing with. Emily returned to Cookie's bedside, but her concentration was shattered by the confrontation. The implied threats against her personally were bad enough, but the casual way Crowley's men had referenced Cookie's illness suggested a level of surveillance that was deeply unsettling. As she worked to keep Cookie's fever down with cool cloths and careful doses of laudanum, she found herself listening constantly for the sound of approaching horses. The feeling of being watched, of being constantly under threat, was wearing on her nerves. It was late afternoon when Cookie's fever finally broke. Emily was dozing in a chair beside his bed when she felt a hand touch her shoulder. She jerked awake to find Cookie looking at her with clear if exhausted eyes. "Water," he croaked, and Emily nearly cried with relief. "Thank God," she whispered, helping him sit up enough to drink. "How do you feel? Like I've been stomped by a bull and dragged behind a horse?" Cookie replied, his voice weak but lucid. "But alive, I reckon. You gave us quite a scare. The infection was spreading and we thought—" Emily trailed off, not wanting to voice how close he'd come to dying. "Heard voices earlier. Sounded like trouble." "Nothing we can't handle," Emily said, though she wasn't sure she believed it herself. Jacob appeared in the doorway as if summoned by their voices. "Cookie, how are you feeling?" "Been better, boss, but Miss Emily here, she pulled me through. Don't know what would have happened if she hadn't been here." Emily felt Jacob's gaze on her warm with gratitude, and something else she didn't dare name. "She's proving herself indispensable in more ways than one," he said quietly. "Boss, I heard some of what those men were saying earlier. About Miss Emily, about boundaries and such. You need to know they've been watching us. I seen men on the ridge behind the east pasture the last couple days." Jacob's expression hardened. "How many men?" "2, maybe 3. They got a camp up there, I think. Been taking turns watching the house." Emily felt cold settle in her stomach. The idea that she'd been going about her daily tasks while hostile men watched from the hills was deeply disturbing. "We'll deal with it," Jacob said grimly. "For now, you focus on getting your strength back." That evening, as Emily prepared dinner for the men who remained at the ranch house, she was acutely aware of the empty places at the table. Half of Jacob's crew was still out tracking the stolen cattle, and those who remained were tense and watchful. "Miss Grant," young Billy said as she served the meal, "is it true what those men said about people talking about you being here?" Emily set down the serving dish and looked around the table at the faces watching her good men who'd accepted her as part of their family, who deserved an honest answer. "People will always find something to talk about, Billy. The question is whether you let their opinions dictate your choices. But if it's causing trouble for the ranch, the only people causing trouble for this ranch are thieves and bullies," Emily said firmly. "I won't be driven away by gossip or threats." "Good," said Charlie with satisfaction, "because we've gotten mighty used to eating decent food and living in a clean house." "More than that," Tom added quietly. "You've made this place feel like a home instead of just a bunkhouse with better accommodations." Emily felt tears prick at her eyes, touched by their acceptance and support. These men barely knew her, but they were willing to stand with her against whatever came. After dinner, as she was cleaning the kitchen, she became aware that Jacob was watching her from the doorway. She'd grown attuned to his presence over the past few days, could sense when he was nearby, even when she couldn't see him. "You've been quiet tonight," she said without turning around, thinking. About the cattle. About a lot of things. Jacob moved into the kitchen, leaning against the counter where he could see her face. "Emily, I need to ask you something and I want an honest answer." She set down the dish she'd been drying and turned to face him. "Of course. Are you having second thoughts about being here, about what you've gotten yourself into?" Emily considered her answer carefully. The truth was complicated, yes. She was frightened by the threats and the surveillance, disturbed by the way her presence was being used against Jacob, but she was also more alive, more herself than she'd been in years. "I'm scared," she said finally. "I'd be foolish not to be, but I'm not having second thoughts. Even knowing that it's going to get worse before it gets better. Even knowing that," Jacob studied her face in the lamplight, and Emily felt her pulse quicken under his intense scrutiny. "Why?" he asked quietly. "Because this is the first place I've ever felt like I truly belonged. Because these men have treated me with more respect and kindness than I ever received from the man who was supposed to marry me. Because—" she paused, knowing she was venturing into dangerous territory. "Because I believe in what you're trying to build here. And if it costs you your reputation, your future prospects—" Emily lifted her chin. "My reputation survived Harold Denton's public rejection. As for my future prospects, I'd rather build something real with people who value me than settle for false security with someone who doesn't." Something shifted in Jacob's expression, surprise, admiration, and something warmer that made Emily's breath catch. "You're not what I expected," he said softly. "What did you expect? Someone who would be grateful for shelter and work quietly in the background, not someone who would stand up to armed men or nurse a dying man back to health, or challenge me to be better than I am. I challenge you." Jacob smiled, and the expression transformed his weathered face. "Every day. You make me want to be worthy of the trust you've placed in me." The moment stretched between them, charged with possibility and danger. Emily was acutely aware of how alone they were, how close Jacob was standing, how easy it would be to close the distance between them. "Jacob," she whispered, not sure what she was asking for. He took a step closer, his hand reaching up to touch her cheek. "Emily, The sound of galloping horses shattered the moment, and Jacob jerked away from her as if he'd been burned. Through the window they could see Tom and several other men riding hard toward the house, their faces grim in the moonlight. Jacob was out the door before Emily could react, and she followed, her heart pounding with a mixture of interrupted desire and sudden fear. "Boss," Tom called out as he dismounted, "we found them. Found the cattle and the men who took them." "Where?" "Miller's Canyon, about 8 miles north. They had them penned in a box canyon, probably planning to move them at first light." "How many men?" 6 that we could see, well armed and ready for trouble." Jacob was already moving toward the barn. "Saddle my horse. We're going to get our cattle back." "Boss," Tom said, catching his arm, "there's something else. We saw smoke coming from the direction of the Peterson place. A lot of smoke." Emily felt her stomach drop. The Peterson Ranch was the closest neighbor to the Triple C, a small operation run by an elderly couple who'd always been friendly with Jacob. "Fire?" Jacob asked. "That'd be my guess, and it started right around the time those men would have been moving through that area." Emily watched Jacob's face harden into something cold and dangerous. "How many men can we muster?" 8 of us here, plus you makes 9. Against 6 we know about, but there could be more." "It'll have to be enough." Jacob turned toward the house, his expression grim. "Emily, I want you to stay inside with the doors locked. Don't open them for anyone but me or one of the men you know." "Jacob, be careful," she said, her voice tight with worry. He paused, looking back at her with an expression that made her heart race. "I will. We'll get our cattle back and check on the Petersons. But if something goes wrong—" "Nothing will go wrong," Emily said firmly. "You're going to handle this and come home safe." "Emily—" He seemed to struggle with something, then shook his head. "Just be careful while we're gone." As the men prepared to ride out, Emily stood on the front porch watching the organized chaos of preparation. Guns were checked, ammunition distributed, horses saddled with swift efficiency. These were not just cowboys anymore. They were an army preparing for war. Jacob swung up into his saddle and looked down at her one final time. "If we're not back by dawn, take the buckboard and ride to town. Find the sheriff and tell him what happened." "You'll be back," Emily said with more confidence than she felt. "Yes," Jacob said quietly. "I will." They rode out into the darkness, leaving Emily alone in the sudden silence. She went back inside and methodically checked all the doors and windows, making sure everything was locked and secure. Then she settled in the kitchen with a rifle Tom had left for her, trying not to think about all the things that could go wrong. The hours crawled by with agonizing slowness. Emily tried to keep busy mending clothes, organizing supplies, anything to keep her hands occupied, and her mind off the dangers facing Jacob and his men. But every sound made her start, every creak of the settling house set her nerves on edge. It was near midnight when she heard the distant sound of gunfire echoing across the hills. Not the sharp crack of hunting rifles, but the sustained rattle of a real fight. Emily gripped the rifle tighter and moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. The gunfire continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Then silence fell again, more ominous than any sound. Emily found herself praying for Jacob's safety, for his men, even for their enemies, to see reason before someone got killed. When the riders finally appeared on the horizon, Emily's heart leaped with relief. She could make out Jacob's tall figure in the lead, and as they drew closer she counted horses. 8 riders, they were 1 short. Emily rushed out onto the porch as the men rode into the yard. Jacob was indeed in the lead, but his left arm hung awkwardly at his side and there was blood on his shirt. "Jacob!" She ran toward him as he dismounted, one-handed and clearly in pain. "I'm all right," he said, though his pale face suggested otherwise. "Bullet grazed my shoulder, nothing more." "What about—" Emily looked around at the grim faces of the men. "Where's Charlie?" "Took a bullet in the leg," Tom reported. "He's alive, but we had to leave him with the Petersons while we brought the cattle home. Doc's with him now." "The Petersons? Their barn was burned, but they're safe. Crowley's men were long gone by the time we got there." Emily helped Jacob into the house, her mind already cataloging what she'd need to tend his wound. As she settled him in the kitchen and began cutting away his bloody shirt, he caught her hand with his good one. "Emily, I need you to understand something. This was just the beginning. Crowley's not going to stop, and it's going to get more dangerous." "I know," she said quietly, focusing on cleaning his wound to avoid looking into his eyes. "But I'm not going anywhere. You could be hurt. If something happened to you because of me—" Emily finally looked up, meeting his intense gaze. "Nothing's going to happen to me. We're going to face whatever comes together and we're going to win." Jacob stared at her for a long moment, and Emily saw something shift in his expression. Decision, determination, and something that looked dangerously like love. "Together," he repeated softly. "Together," Emily confirmed, and as she bent to bandage his wound, she knew that whatever came next, she would face it, standing beside this man. The woman who had been rejected at a train station was gone, replaced by someone stronger. Someone who belonged here, in this hard land with these good people. The war with Crowley was just beginning, but Emily Grant was no longer running from her past. She was fighting for her future. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor that would change everything. Emily was hanging laundry behind the house when she heard the sound of a single horse approaching at a steady pace. She rounded the corner to see a man in a black suit dismounting near the front porch, not one of Crowley's thugs, but someone official-looking, with a badge glinting on his vest. Jacob emerged from the barn, his arm still in a sling from the previous night's encounter. Emily could see the tension in his posture as he approached the stranger. "Sheriff Morrison," Jacob said, his voice carefully neutral. "What brings you out this way?" "Morning, Jacob. Heard there was some trouble last night. Gunfire, cattle rustling, property damage." The sheriff was a weathered man in his 50s with intelligent eyes that missed nothing. "Thought I'd better come see for myself what's going on." Emily moved closer, sensing that this conversation would determine much about their future. She could see other ranch hands emerging from various buildings, all of them watchful and ready. "We recovered our stolen cattle," Jacob said simply. 50 head that were taken from our east pasture, found them penned up in Miller's Canyon with 6 armed men standing guard. "And these men, where are they now?" "Gone. They rode off when we arrived to reclaim our property." Sheriff Morrison's eyes narrowed slightly. "That's not quite the story I heard in town this morning. Word is, there was a regular war out there with bullets flying and folks getting hurt." "Someone shot at us when we tried to recover our own cattle," Jacob replied evenly. "We defended ourselves." "Charlie Watson's laid up with a bullet in his leg, I hear." "Charlie will be fine. Doc says the bullet went clean through." Emily watched the careful dance of words, understanding that much more was at stake here than a simple cattle rustling case. The sheriff's next words confirmed her suspicions. "Jacob, I'm going to speak plain with you. Silas Crowley came to see me this morning. He's got some serious concerns about what's happening out here." "I'm sure he does." "He says you're harboring a woman of questionable reputation, that there's been improper conduct going on, and that you've been making threats against his men." Emily felt her cheeks burn with anger. But before she could speak, Jacob stepped forward, his voice dropping to a dangerous level. "Sheriff, I'd be very careful about repeating accusations like that without proof. Miss Grant is a respectable woman who works as my housekeeper. Any man who suggests otherwise is a liar. Now, Jacob, I'm just telling you what was said, but you have to admit the situation is unusual. A single woman living alone with 12 men, no female supervision or chaperone. The situation is perfectly proper, Emily said, stepping forward. She'd remained silent long enough. I have my own room. I'm treated with complete respect by every man on this ranch, and my reputation is intact. Sheriff Morrison tipped his hat to her. Ma'am, I don't doubt your word, but you have to understand how it looks to folks in town. How it looks and what's true are two different things, Emily replied firmly. Mr. Crowley is trying to use gossip and innuendo to damage Mr. Carver's standing in the community because he wants this land. That's a serious accusation, miss. It's a serious situation, Jacob interjected. Crowley's been pressuring me to sell for 3 years. When I refused, strange things started happening. Cattle disappearing, equipment being sabotaged, and now outright theft. You have proof of Crowley's involvement. The men who stole our cattle were riding horses with Crowley's brand. We all saw them clearly. Sheriff Morrison was quiet for a long moment, his weathered face thoughtful. Emily could see him weighing the competing claims, trying to separate truth from rumor. Here's what I'm going to do, he said finally. I'm going to investigate both sides of this story. But Jacob, I'm warning you, keep things quiet and legal. If there's any more gunplay, if anyone else gets hurt, I'll have to take action. Understood. But Sheriff, I have a right to protect my property and the people under my roof. You do. Just make sure that's all you're protecting. After the sheriff left, Emily found herself in the kitchen preparing lunch with shaking hands. The confrontation had been civilized on the surface, but she understood the underlying message clearly enough. Crowley was using her presence to undermine Jacob's reputation, and it was working. Jacob appeared in the doorway, his face grim. We need to talk. Emily set down the knife she'd been using to slice bread and turned to face him. About what the sheriff said. About a lot of things. Jacob moved into the kitchen, favoring his injured arm. Emily, maybe it would be better if you went to town for a while, found a room at the boarding house until this situation with Crowley gets resolved. No. The simple refusal hung in the air between them. Jacob blinked clearly, having expected a different response. Emily, be reasonable. Your reputation... My reputation is based on who I am and what I do, not on what small-minded people choose to believe. Emily lifted her chin defiantly. I won't be driven away by gossip and lies. This isn't just about gossip anymore. Crowley's escalating things and you could get hurt. I could get hurt crossing the street in town. I could get hurt falling down the stairs. Life is dangerous, Jacob. That doesn't mean you stop living it. Jacob stared at her for a long moment, and Emily saw something shift in his expression. Frustration giving way to admiration. You're the most stubborn woman I've ever met, he said softly. Good. Because you're going to need stubborn to get through what's coming. That afternoon brought news that chilled Emily to the bone. Billy came racing back from town with word that Harold Denton had been spreading stories about her throughout Copper Falls. He's telling folks that you tried to trap him into marriage with false pretenses. Billy reported, his young face flushed with anger. Says you came here because no decent man would have you back east. Emily felt the familiar burn of humiliation, but this time it was tempered by rage. And people are believing him. Some are. Others are saying he's just bitter because you found better prospects. Better prospects? Emily repeated bitterly. Is that what they think this is? Jacob's jaw tightened. What people think doesn't matter. What matters is the truth. The truth doesn't seem to carry much weight in this situation, Emily replied. Lies travel faster and stick longer. That evening, as Emily prepared dinner for the reduced crew, several men were still out watching for more trouble. She found herself thinking about the impossible position she'd created. Her presence was being used as a weapon against Jacob, undermining everything he'd worked to build. The honorable thing might be to leave to remove herself as a source of controversy. But the thought of leaving the Triple C, of abandoning the first real home she'd ever known, was unbearable. More than that, she was beginning to understand that this fight was about more than just her reputation or Jacob's land. It was about whether good people could stand up to bullies and win. Miss Emily. Billy's voice interrupted her brooding. Can I ask you something? Of course. Are you going to leave because of what folks are saying? Emily looked at the young man's earnest face, seeing her own fears reflected there. Billy had come west, looking for a new life just as she had. He'd found a family at the Triple C just as she had. If she ran away now, what message would that send to him and the others? No, Billy, I'm not going to leave. Good, he said with relief, because this place wouldn't be the same without you. As the men finished dinner and began to disperse to their evening tasks, Emily noticed Tom Bradley lingering in the kitchen. The foreman's weathered face was troubled as he approached her. Miss Emily, I need to tell you something and I need you to listen careful-like. Emily set down the dish towel she'd been holding and gave him her full attention. What is it, Tom? I rode into town this afternoon to pick up supplies. Heard some talk that's got me worried. What kind of talk? Crowley's been busy. He's got folks convinced that Jacob's lost his moral compass, that he's not the kind of man they want as a neighbor anymore. More than that, he's been suggesting that maybe it's time for a change in local leadership. Emily felt cold settle in her stomach. What does that mean? It means he's been talking to the town council, the business owners, anyone with influence, making them think that Jacob's become a liability to the community. And they're listening. Some are. Crowley's got money and power and he knows how to use both. He's painting himself as the responsible citizen trying to restore proper moral standards. Emily sank into a chair, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. It's all because of me, isn't it, if I hadn't come here? Now you stop that kind of thinking right there, Tom said firmly. Crowley's been after this ranch for years. He would have found another excuse if it wasn't you. But I made it easy for him. You made it personal for him. There's a difference. Tom pulled up a chair across from her. Miss Emily, I've been working ranches for 30 years, and I've seen men like Crowley before. They use whatever weapon comes to hand, but they always find a weapon. So what do? We fight back, but not the way you might think. Before Tom could explain further, Jacob appeared in the doorway. What are you two plotting in here? Just discussing strategy, boss, Tom replied. And I think Miss Emily needs to hear what I've got to say. Jacob joined them at the table, his expression serious. I'm listening. We can't win this fight with guns, Tom said bluntly. Crowley's got us outnumbered and he's got the law on his side, or at least neutral. But we might be able to win it another way. How? Emily asked. By beating him at his own game. He's using your reputation against us, making folks think there's something improper going on here. What if we took that weapon away from him? Jacob's eyes narrowed. What are you suggesting? Tom looked between them, his expression serious. I'm suggesting that maybe it's time you two got married. The words hit the kitchen like a thunderclap. Emily felt her heart stop, then start again at double speed. Marriage. To Jacob. The idea was so far beyond anything she'd allowed herself to imagine that she couldn't even process it properly. Tom, Jacob said carefully, it's not that simple. Why isn't it? Tom pressed. You two care about each other. Anyone with eyes can see that. Marriage would solve the reputation problem overnight and take away Crowley's biggest weapon. Emily found her voice, though it came out smaller than she'd intended. Marriage should be about more than solving problems. Should be, yes, Tom agreed. But sometimes practical considerations have to come first, especially when people's lives are at stake. Jacob stood abruptly pacing to the window. Even if that were a solution, it wouldn't be fair to Emily. She shouldn't have to marry someone just to save his ranch. What if she wanted to? Tom asked quietly. The question hung in the air like smoke. Emily felt her cheeks burn as both men looked at her, waiting for an answer she wasn't sure she could give. She began, then stopped. How could she explain that the idea of marrying Jacob terrified and thrilled her in equal measure? That she'd begun to love him despite every reason not to? That the thought of being his wife felt like a dream too wonderful to be real? This is ridiculous, Jacob said harshly, apparently taking her silence for rejection. Emily came here looking for honest work, not to be pressured into marriage by circumstances. Did she? Tom asked mildly. Seems to me she came here looking for a home and a family. Question is, whether she's found both. Emily stood up slowly, her legs unsteady. I think I need some air." She walked out onto the front porch, leaving the two men behind. The evening was cool and clear, with stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. She could hear the distant sound of cattle settling down for the night, the low murmur of conversation from the bunkhouse, the normal sounds of the ranch that had become so familiar. Marriage to Jacob. The idea sent shivers through her that had nothing to do with the cool air. She tried to imagine waking up every morning knowing she belonged here permanently, knowing that Jacob was truly hers and she was his. The thought was intoxicating, but it was also terrifying. What if he only agreed out of obligation? What if the marriage was purely practical, a business arrangement to solve their problems? Could she bear to be married to a man she loved if he didn't love her in return? She was so lost in thought that she didn't hear footsteps on the porch until Jacob spoke. "Emily, are you all right?" She turned to find him standing in the doorway, his expression uncertain. "I'm fine, just thinking." "About what Tom said?" "Among other things." Jacob moved to stand beside her at the porch railing, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "Emily, I want you to know that you're under no obligation. That is just because Tom suggested. I would never expect you to—" "Jacob." She turned to face him, cutting off his stumbling words. "What do you want?" "What do I want? Not what's practical or strategic or proper. What do you want?" Jacob was quiet for a long moment, his blue eyes searching her face in the starlight. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I want you to stay. I want to know that you'll be here tomorrow and the day after and all the days after that. I want to have the right to protect you, to care for you, to—" He stopped, shaking his head. "But I won't trap you into marriage just to solve my problems." Emily felt her heart swell with something that might have been hope. What if it solved my problems too? What problems? The problem of loving a man who might not love me back. The problem of wanting a home and family so badly it hurts. The problem of not knowing where I belong in the world. Jacob stared at her, his expression shifting from confusion to wonder. "Emily, are you saying—" "I'm saying that if you asked me to marry you, really asked me not as a strategy, but as a man asking a woman he cares about, I would say yes." The silence stretched between them, charged with possibility and fear. Emily could hear her own heartbeat, could feel the weight of her confession hanging in the air. "You would—" Jacob's voice was rough with emotion. "I would." Jacob reached out slowly, as if afraid she might disappear, and cupped her face in his hands. "Emily Grant, will you marry me?" "Yes," she whispered, and then his lips were on hers, gentle at first, then with growing passion as she responded. When they finally broke apart, Emily felt dizzy with happiness and terror. "Jacob, what if this doesn't work? What if people still talk or Crowley finds another way to hurt you?" "Then we'll face it together," Jacob said firmly, "as husband and wife." "When?" she asked, practical considerations already crowding into her mind. "As soon as possible." "Tomorrow, if we can arrange it." Emily's eyes widened. "Tomorrow, but there's so much to plan. We don't need a big ceremony, Emily. We just need each other and a preacher and someone to stand as witnesses." The next morning dawned bright and clear, and Emily woke with butterflies dancing in her stomach. She was going to be married today. To Jacob. The thought seemed impossible even as she lived it. The men had taken the news with varying degrees of surprise and approval. Billy had whooped with joy, Charlie had grumbled good-naturedly about losing the best cook in the territory to the boss, and Tom had smiled with quiet satisfaction at seeing his plan come to fruition. "Mrs. Carver," Emily said aloud, testing the sound of it. It felt strange and wonderful on her tongue. A knock at her door interrupted her preparations. "Emily, it's Tom. The preacher's here." Emily's heart leaped. Reverend Thomas had agreed to perform the ceremony after Jacob had ridden into town at first light to make arrangements. There had been some raised eyebrows and whispered conversations, but the good Reverend had ultimately decided that a proper Christian marriage was exactly what the situation required. Emily opened the door to find Tom holding a small bouquet of wildflowers. "From the boys," he said gruffly. "Figured you should have something pretty to carry." Tears pricked at Emily's eyes. These rough cowboys had become her family, and their thoughtfulness touched her more than she could express. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything. You ready for this, Miss Emily?" I am. She made her way downstairs to find the main room transformed. Someone had moved furniture to create an aisle, and wildflowers decorated every surface. Jacob stood at the far end of the room with Reverend Thomas wearing his best suit and looking more nervous than she'd ever seen him. When he saw her, his expression shifted to something that took her breath away. Love, wonder, and absolute certainty. She could see it all in his blue eyes. "Dearly beloved," Reverend Thomas began, "we are gathered here today to witness the union of Jacob Carver and Emily Grant in holy matrimony." The ceremony was simple but beautiful. Emily found herself trembling as she spoke her vows, promising to love and honor this man for the rest of her life. When Jacob slipped his mother's ring onto her finger, a simple gold band that fit perfectly, she felt something settle into place in her soul. "You may kiss the bride," Reverend Thomas announced, and Jacob did thoroughly and tenderly while the cowboys cheered and whistled their approval. "Mrs. Carver," Jacob said softly when they broke apart. "Mr. Carver," Emily replied, her heart full to bursting. The celebration was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. Through the window, Emily could see a group of riders heading toward the house, more than a dozen men, all armed and riding with purpose. "Crowley," Jacob said grimly, his hand moving instinctively toward his gun. Emily felt her moment of perfect happiness evaporate as reality crashed back in. Even marriage wouldn't stop Silas Crowley from trying to take what he wanted. If anything, it might only make him more desperate. "Well," she said, surprising herself with how steady her voice sounded, "I suppose it's time to find out if Mrs. Carver is made of sterner stuff than Miss Grant." Jacob looked at her with something that might have been pride. "I have a feeling Crowley's about to find out he's picked a fight with the wrong woman." Emily squeezed her new husband's hand and smiled. "He certainly has." The riders were almost at the house now, and Emily could see Crowley himself in the lead, his face dark with rage. Whatever he'd planned to accomplish today, her marriage to Jacob had clearly disrupted his strategy. But Emily was no longer the desperate woman who'd been rejected at a train station. She was Mrs. Jacob Carver, now mistress of the Triple C Ranch, and she'd be damned if she'd let anyone drive her from her home without a fight. "Let him come," she said quietly. "We're ready for him." Crowley and his men thundered into the ranch yard with the force of a storm dust, swirling around their horses as they pulled up in a loose semicircle facing the house. Emily could see the calculation in Crowley's eyes as he took in the scene, the wedding decorations still visible through the windows, the men of the Triple C arranged defensively around the porch, and most importantly, Emily standing beside Jacob wearing his mother's ring. "Well, well," Crowley said, his voice carrying easily across the yard. "Looks like I missed a celebration. How convenient." Jacob stepped forward, his injured arm forgotten as he faced down the man who'd been terrorizing his neighbors for years. "Crowley, you're not welcome here." "Now, Jacob, is that any way to greet a neighbor who's come to offer congratulations? I hear you've taken yourself a wife. Rather sudden, wasn't it?" Emily felt the implied insult like a slap, but she kept her expression calm. She could see Tom and the other hands positioning themselves strategically ready for whatever might come. "Our marriage is none of your concern," Jacob replied coldly. "Oh, but it is my concern. You see, I've been telling folks in town about the irregular situation here. A desperate woman, a lonely rancher, improper arrangements. But marriage, well, that changes things, doesn't it? Makes everything respectable." Crowley's smile was like a blade. Of course, it also raises new questions, like whether this marriage is real or just another deception designed to protect reputations. Emily had heard enough. She stepped forward, moving to stand beside her husband with her chin held high. "Mr. Crowley, I'm afraid you've wasted a trip. As you can see, there's nothing irregular about our situation anymore." "Mrs. Carver, is it?" Crowley's eyes raked over her with undisguised contempt. "How quickly things change. Yesterday you were a rejected mail-order bride with nowhere to go. Today you're the lady of the manor. Quite a transformation." "Yes, it is," Emily replied evenly. "Some might call it the American dream. Others might call it good fortune. What would you call it?" "I'd call it suspicious. A woman arrives in town, gets publicly humiliated, and within days she's married to one of the most eligible bachelors in the county. Either you're very lucky, Mrs. Carver, or very clever." Jacob's hand moved toward his gun, but Emily touched his arm, stopping him. She could handle this herself. "Mr. Crowley, You seem to be laboring under the misapprehension that my personal affairs are somehow your business. Let me assure you they are not. This is private property, and you and your men are trespassing." "Trespassing?" Crowley laughed a harsh sound that set Emily's teeth on edge. "I don't think so. You see, there are questions about the boundaries of this property. Questions about whether certain deeds are valid." Tom Bradley stepped forward, his weathered face grim. "What the hell are you talking about, Crowley?" "I'm talking about irregularities in the land records, survey markers that don't match original plats, deeds that might have been misrepresented when this property was sold." Emily felt cold dread settle in her stomach. This was Crowley's real attack, not just on their reputations, but on their legal right to the land itself. "That's a lie," Jacob said flatly. "My deed is clear and registered with the county." "Is it? Are you certain? Because I've had some very interesting conversations with county officials lately. It seems there are discrepancies that need to be investigated." Emily watched Jacob's face pale as the implications sank in. If Crowley could challenge the validity of the deed, he could tie them up in legal battles for years, potentially forcing them off the land while the courts sorted everything out. "Even if you had grounds for such a challenge, which you don't," Emily said carefully, "it would be a matter for the courts to decide." "Oh, it will be. But in the meantime, I'm afraid I have to protect my interests. You see, if this property rightfully belongs to me, then these cattle, this house, everything here is being unlawfully occupied." The threat was clear now. Crowley was preparing to seize the ranch by force, using manufactured legal pretenses as justification. "You son of a bitch!" Jacob snarled, his hand closing on his gun. Now, Jacob. Let's keep this civilized. I'm simply serving notice that this property is in dispute. I suggest you gather your belongings and move on peacefully. It would be unfortunate if anyone got hurt over a misunderstanding." Emily looked around at Crowley's men, hard-faced gunfighters who clearly weren't cowboys. These were professional killers brought in specifically for this confrontation. "How much?" she asked suddenly. Everyone turned to look at her. Crowley raised an eyebrow. "I beg your pardon. How much would it take to end this? You want our land. We want to keep it. Surely there's a price that would satisfy everyone." Jacob stared at her in shock. "Emily, what are you doing? Being practical." She replied, never taking her eyes off Crowley. "Mr. Crowley is a businessman. Businessmen understand profit and loss. What's your price?" Crowley's smile widened. "You're more interesting than I gave you credit for, Mrs. Carver, but this isn't about money anymore. It's about principle. About making sure the right kind of people control the resources of this county." "And what kind of people would that be?" "Established families, people with deep roots and genuine commitment to the community, not drifters and opportunists who show up with suspicious stories and questionable morals." Emily felt rage build in her chest, but she kept her voice level. "I see. So this is about more than land. This is about deciding who belongs and who doesn't." "Exactly. And I'm afraid you and your husband don't belong." Emily looked around at the faces watching her, Jacob's men who'd accepted her as family, Tom who'd become like a father to her, Billy who looked up to her like a sister. These were good people, honest people who'd welcomed her when she had nothing. "You're wrong," she said quietly. "This is exactly where I belong." "We'll see about that," Crowley replied. "Boys, I think it's time we conducted a proper survey of this property. Make sure the boundaries are correctly marked." His men began to dismount, hands resting on their weapons. Emily could feel violence building in the air like pressure before a storm. "Wait," she said, and something in her voice made everyone pause. "Before you start shooting people over surveying rights, maybe you should know something." "What's that?" Emily reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. This morning, when Jacob went to town to arrange for the preacher, he also stopped by the telegraph office. We sent a wire to the territorial governor's office in Helena describing the situation here. We also sent wires to newspapers in Billings and Great Falls. Crowley's eyes narrowed. "What are you talking about? We're talking about making the situation very public very quickly. If shooting starts here today, it won't be some quiet range dispute that gets buried in local politics. It'll be front-page news across Montana territory. Wealthy rancher uses armed force to steal land from newlyweds." How do you think that will play with the territorial authorities? Emily could see uncertainty flicker in Crowley's eyes. His strength had always been his ability to operate in the shadows using his wealth and influence to quietly eliminate opposition. Public scrutiny was the last thing he wanted. "You're bluffing," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Am I, Tom? Would you be so kind as to show Mr. Crowley the telegraph receipts?" Tom Bradley stepped forward with a piece of paper in his hand. "Right here, Crowley. 3 wires sent this morning. Want to read them?" Crowley's face flushed red with anger. "Clever, but it won't work. I have friends in Helena, friends who understand the importance of maintaining order and property rights." "I'm sure you do," Emily agreed. "But do those friends want to explain to voters why they're supporting armed land grabs? This is 1885, Crowley, not 1865. The days of taking what you want by force are ending." "You think you're very smart, don't you?" Crowley's voice was venomous. "But you've made a mistake. You've made this personal." "It was already personal," Emily replied. "The moment you decided that decent people didn't belong here, you made it personal." Crowley stared at her for a long moment, his face a mask of barely controlled rage. Emily could see him calculating, weighing his options against the new risks she'd introduced. "This isn't over," he said finally. "Marriage or no marriage, telegrams or no telegrams, this land will be mine." "Maybe," Emily said calmly, "but not today." Crowley wheeled his horse around and spurred it toward the road. "Mount up," he shouted to his men. "We're done here." As the riders thundered away, Emily felt her knees go weak with relief. Jacob caught her arm, steadying her. "Emily, what telegrams?" he asked quietly. She smiled shakily. "I have no idea. I was bluffing completely." Jacob stared at her, then threw back his head and laughed. "You magnificent, impossible woman. You just faced down 15 armed men with nothing but pure brass and a convincing lie." "I had good backup," Emily said, looking around at the men who'd stood ready to fight beside her. "We all did." Tom Bradley shook his head in amazement. "Ma'am, that was the gutsiest thing I've ever seen. But you know he'll be back." "Yes," Emily agreed. "But next time we'll be ready for him. And next time maybe we really will send those telegrams." The celebration of their marriage resumed, but it was tempered by the knowledge that they'd won only a temporary victory. Crowley would regroup, find new strategies, new ways to pressure them. But as Emily looked around at the faces of the men who'd become her family, she felt a deep sense of peace. She'd found her place in the world, found people worth fighting for, found a man worth loving. That evening, as the last of the wedding guests dispersed to the bunkhouse, Emily found herself alone with Jacob on the front porch. The stars stretched endlessly overhead, and the night air was cool and sweet with the scent of prairie grass. "Any regrets?" Jacob asked softly. Emily considered the question seriously. She thought about the life she'd planned, safe, predictable, respectable. Then she thought about the life she'd found challenging, uncertain, but rich with purpose and love. "None," she said firmly. "You. Only that I waited so long to ask you." Jacob took her hand, and Emily marveled at how perfectly it fit in his. They stood in comfortable silence, listening to the sounds of the ranch settling down for the night. "Jacob," she said finally, "what really happened to the original deed for this property?" He was quiet for so long that Emily wondered if he'd heard her. When he spoke, his voice was careful. "The man I bought this place from was desperate to leave. His wife had died and he couldn't face staying here anymore. He sold it to me for half what it was worth cash money and left on the next train east. And the paperwork was done in a hurry. Some of the formalities might have been overlooked." Emily felt her heart sink. So Crowley might actually have grounds for a legal challenge. Possibly. The deed is registered, but if he can prove irregularities in the original sale... Jacob trailed off. Emily absorbed this information, understanding now why Crowley was so confident. How long would a legal challenge take? Years probably, and it would cost more money than we have to fight it properly. So we need to find another way. Jacob turned to look at her, his expression serious. "Emily, I need you to understand something. If Crowley succeeds in challenging the deed, we could lose everything. The ranch, the house, even the cattle. You could find yourself married to a man with nothing but the clothes on his back." Emily smiled. Jacob Carver, I fell in love with you when I thought you were just a cowboy offering me honest work. Do you really think I care whether you're rich or poor? I care. I want to give you the life you deserve. You already have. You've given me a home, a family, a purpose. You've given me love and respect and the chance to be part of something bigger than myself. What more could any woman want? Jacob cupped her face in his hands, his blue eyes bright with emotion. I love you, Emily Carver. I love you too, Jacob Carver. The next few weeks passed in a strange kind of peace. Crowley made no overt moves against them, but his presence hung over the ranch like a storm cloud. Emily threw herself into the business of running the household, but she also began to quietly gather information. She corresponded with officials in Helena researching territorial laws regarding land ownership and deed transfers. She cultivated relationships with the wives of other ranchers, building a network of women who could influence their husbands' opinions. Most importantly, she began documenting everything, every threat, every suspicious incident, every piece of evidence that might prove Crowley's harassment. You're building a case, Jacob observed one evening as he found her at the kitchen table surrounded by papers and correspondence. I'm building our defense, Emily corrected. If this goes to court, we need more than just the deed. We need to show a pattern of intimidation and harassment. We need witnesses' documentation proof that Crowley's been using illegal methods to acquire land. Jacob sat down across from her, studying the neat piles of papers. Where did you learn about legal strategy? My father had dealings with lawyers when we lost our farm. I watched how they operated, how they built cases and destroyed them. I learned that truth isn't enough. You need evidence and witnesses and the right presentation. And if evidence and witnesses aren't enough... Emily looked up from her papers, her green eyes steady. Then we make sure the cost of taking our land is higher than the value of having it. 3 weeks after their wedding, the formal legal challenge arrived via sheriff's deputy. Emily read the papers with a sinking heart, recognizing the thoroughness of Crowley's preparation. He was claiming that the original deed was invalid due to procedural irregularities, that the land had never been properly transferred, and that he had a prior claim dating back to a territorial grant. It's cleverly done, she admitted to Jacob as they reviewed the documents. He's not claiming outright fraud, just technical violations that would be easy to prove. Can we fight it? We can try. But it will take months, maybe years, and we'll need lawyers we can't afford. Jacob was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the land he'd worked so hard to build up. Maybe it's time to cut our losses, take what we can get and start over somewhere else. No, Emily's voice was sharp with determination. This is our home, Jacob. These are our people. We don't run. That night, Emily lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing through possibilities and strategies. There had to be a way to beat Crowley at his own game, some weakness they could exploit. The answer came to her just before dawn, sudden and clear as sunlight. She slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Jacob, and made her way downstairs to the kitchen. By the time the men arrived for breakfast, she had a plan. Tom, she said as the foreman filled his coffee cup, I need you to take a ride into town today. There are some people I need you to talk to. What kind of people? The kind who might have stories to tell about Silas Crowley's business practices. The kind who might be willing to share those stories if they knew someone was listening. Tom's weathered face creased in a slow smile. You thinking what I think you're thinking? I'm thinking that a man doesn't build an empire the size of Crowley's without breaking a few rules along the way. And I'm thinking that broken rules leave tracks if you know where to look. Over the next 2 weeks, Emily's network of informants began to bear fruit. Tom returned from his rides with stories of intimidation, bribery, and worse. Small ranchers who'd been forced to sell after mysterious accidents destroyed their herds. Business owners who'd been pressured to support Crowley's political ambitions. Officials who'd been bought or threatened into cooperation. But stories weren't enough. Emily needed proof documentation evidence that would stand up in court. She began making trips to town herself, ostensibly to shop, but actually to cultivate sources and gather information. It was during one of these trips that she encountered Harold Denton outside the Mercantile. Her former intended husband looked uncomfortable when he saw her, his eyes darting around as if looking for escape. Mrs. Carver, I heard about your marriage. Congratulations." "Thank you, Harold." Emily kept her voice polite but cool. I want you to know that I've been thinking about our last conversation, about what was said at the train station. I may have been hasty in my judgment." Emily studied his face, seeing something there that might have been guilt. "It's in the past, Harold. We've both moved on." "Yes, but, well, I've been hearing things lately about Crowley and his plans, about pressure being put on certain people to tell certain stories." Emily felt her pulse quicken. "What kind of pressure?" Harold glanced around nervously. "The kind that makes a man reconsider what he's willing to say in public. The kind that makes him realize maybe he was wrong about certain situations." "Harold, what are you trying to tell me?" "I'm trying to tell you that if anyone asks me about what happened at the train station, about why I ended our engagement, I'm going to tell them the truth. That you were exactly what you represented yourself to be, and I was a fool to let Crowley convince me otherwise." Emily stared at him in shock. "Crowley convinced you to reject me?" Harold's face flushed red. He said you were probably a confidence woman trying to trap men into marriage for their money. He said decent men needed to protect themselves against women like you." "And you believed him?" "I was nervous about the whole arrangement, and when he put doubts in my head, I let them grow into certainties. I'm ashamed of how I treated you, Emily. You deserved better." Emily felt pieces clicking into place in her mind. "Harold, would you be willing to testify about Crowley's involvement in our broken engagement?" "If it comes to that, yes. I owe you that much." Emily left town that day with new hope and new evidence. If Crowley had interfered in her personal affairs, it suggested a pattern of manipulation that went beyond simple business competition. But the real breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Charlie Watson, still recovering from his bullet wound, had been spending his time talking to other injured ranch hands at the doctor's office. It was there that he met a former employee of Crowley's, a man named Pete Michaels, who'd been fired for asking too many questions about missing cattle. "He's got records," Charlie reported to Emily and Jacob. "Ledgers showing cattle that were bought but never paid for, horses that were stolen and resold, all kinds of shady dealing. But he's scared to come forward." "What's he afraid of?" Emily asked. "Same thing we all are. Crowley's got a long reach and a longer memory. But Pete says if he could be guaranteed protection, if he knew his testimony would matter, he might be willing to talk." Emily looked at Jacob, seeing her own thoughts reflected in his eyes. "We need those records. It would be dangerous. If Crowley finds out, we'll deal with it. But if we don't try, we lose everything anyway." The plan they devised was simple but risky. Tom would approach Pete Michaels with an offer safe passage to another territory and enough money to start over in exchange for his testimony and whatever records he could provide. Meanwhile, Emily would travel to Helena to meet with territorial officials armed with all the evidence they'd gathered. "You're not going alone," Jacob said firmly when Emily outlined her intentions. "I have to. You're needed here to keep the ranch running and watch for Crowley's next move. Besides, I can travel faster alone and I'm less likely to be seen as a threat." "Emily, if something happens to you, nothing will happen to me. I'm going to take the train to Helena, present our evidence to the Territorial Attorney General, and come home. Simple." Jacob didn't look convinced, but he also understood the necessity. If they were going to beat Crowley, they needed allies in high places. Emily left for Helena on a Tuesday morning carrying a carpet bag full of documents and a heart full of determination. The journey took 2 days, and she used the time to prepare her presentation, rehearsing arguments and anticipating questions. Helena was a bustling city compared to Copper Falls, full of politicians and businessmen who controlled the territory's future. Emily felt intimidated as she made her way to the Territorial Capitol building, but she forced herself to project confidence she didn't entirely feel. The Territorial Attorney General, Jonathan Wesley, was a serious man in his 50s who listened to Emily's presentation with careful attention. She laid out the evidence methodically, the pattern of harassment, the questionable land deals, the interference in personal affairs, the use of violence and intimidation. "Mrs. Carver," Wesley said when she finished, "these are serious allegations. Do you understand the implications of what you're suggesting? I understand that Silas Crowley has been operating outside the law for years and that he's using his wealth and influence to avoid accountability. I understand that if good people don't stand up to bullies, the bullies win." Wesley studied the documents she'd provided, his expression thoughtful. Some of this evidence is compelling, but much of it is circumstantial. To build a case against a man of Crowley's stature, we'd need ironclad proof of criminal activity. We have a witness, a former employee willing to testify about fraudulent business practices. One witness with a grudge against his former employer. A good lawyer could discredit him easily. Emily felt her heart sink, but she pressed on. What would you need? What kind of proof would be sufficient? Direct evidence of a specific crime, documentation of fraud or theft, multiple credible witnesses to illegal activities. Emily left Helena with mixed feelings. Wesley hadn't dismissed her case entirely, but he'd made it clear that they needed stronger evidence to proceed. The legal system moved slowly and cautiously, especially when dealing with powerful men like Crowley. But she hadn't given up. If the law couldn't protect them, she'd find another way. The train journey home gave her time to think and plan. By the time she arrived back at Copper Falls, she knew exactly what needed to be done. Jacob was waiting for her at the station, his face tense with worry. "How did it go?" "Better than I expected, but not as well as I hoped," Emily replied honestly. "We need more evidence, but I think I know how to get it." They rode home in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. As they crested the hill overlooking the Triple C, Emily felt her heart lift at the sight of the ranch spread out below them. Whatever it took, however long it took, she was going to protect this place and these people. That evening, as they sat on the front porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Emily outlined her new plan. "We're going to give Crowley exactly what he wants," she said quietly. Jacob turned to stare at her. "What do you mean?" "We're going to let him think he's winning. We're going to appear to weaken to give up the fight, and when he gets confident, when he thinks he's safe, we're going to expose him for what he really is." "Emily, that's incredibly dangerous. If something goes wrong, then we'll face the consequences together." "But Jacob, I've been thinking about this whole situation, and I realized something. Crowley's weakness isn't his business practices or his political connections. It's his pride. His pride. He can't resist humiliating people who oppose him. He doesn't just want to win, he wants to be seen winning. That's what makes him vulnerable." Emily took Jacob's hand, intertwining their fingers. "We're going to give him the chance to gloat publicly about destroying us. And when he does, when he reveals exactly how he's been operating, we're going to have witnesses and evidence and everything we need to bring him down." Jacob was quiet for a long moment, studying his wife's determined face in the fading light. "You realize that if this plan fails, we lose everything." "We're going to lose everything anyway if we don't try," Emily replied. "At least this way we go down fighting." Jacob squeezed her hand. "Then we fight." As the stars began to appear overhead, Emily felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. She'd come to Montana as a desperate woman with nowhere else to go. She'd found love, family, purpose, and a home worth fighting for. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers, new tests of their resolve. But tonight she was exactly where she belonged, sitting beside the man she loved on the porch of their home, planning their future and preparing for whatever came next. The woman who'd been rejected at a train station was gone forever, replaced by someone stronger. Someone who belonged to this land and these people as surely as they belonged to her. Emily Carver was ready for whatever Silas Crowley could throw at them. She was ready to win.